In our last episode, we talked about the great intellectual rebellions of the 19th century. We watched Alexander Hamilton design a system of protective tariffs and state-sponsored espionage. We watched Prussia build a massive fortress wall around its domestic markets with the Zollverein. And we watched the Japanese samurai completely dismantle their feudal society to build state-owned shipyards and factories. But there is a glaring practical problem with everything we just talked about. You see, you can pass all the protective tariffs in the world. You can steal the blueprints for the most advanced British steam engine. But if you don't have a way to move your raw materials to the factory, and if the workers standing on your assembly line can't read the operating manual, your economic revolution is dead on arrival. Beneath the grand sweeping debates over laissez-faire and protectionism lies a highly practical fundamental truth. All successful economic development relies on a powerful enabling state. Today we are looking at two massive capital-intensive public goods that actually make the Industrial Revolution possible: physical transportation and public education. We are going to look at how nations laid the tracks and trained the minds that built the modern world. I'm your host, Devin Hillsdon-Smith, and you're listening to Site Selectors Are People Too. This is episode 7 of The Architects of Prosperity, The Unseen Foundations. Let's get into it. Welcome back. Before we dive into the dirt, the steel, and the chalkboards of the 19th century, a quick note from not Hyphen Strategies, but from me, Devin, to you, the listeners. When I first started this history section, which we are now calling the Architects of Prosperity, I really didn't know how many of you would tune in. It's a deep dive. It's nerdy. It's different. But you know what? I have heard time and time again from listeners, from people that know listeners, you enjoy this stuff. And that makes my heart sing. So I just wanted to thank all of you for tuning in and learning a little bit more about the history of this profession that we love, that we fight for, that we spend our days and nights obsessing over: economic development and corporate site selection. Another note, if you or your company are looking for a unique advertising opportunity, we are going to open up sponsorships in season 4 to external third parties. We have a pitch kit, a brand guide, all of the good stuff so that you can understand exactly what you're getting for your dollars. It's not expensive. Get in at the ground floor before this thing blows up. But just wanted to throw that out there. I'm going to tease that up a little bit as we move this forward, leading through the last episodes, 7 episodes, 7, let's see here, 7, 8, 9, 10, 4 episodes of The Architects of Prosperity, followed by a story from the road with Jim Plump. And then we're going to be starting season 4 later this summer. So if you or your company have interest in a creative sponsorship advertising, reach out. Devin at hyphenstrategiesllc.com. All right, let's get our boots on the ground. All right, welcome back to the Architects of Prosperity. And giving you a sneak peek behind the scenes here, my 4th time trying to record this segment. Let's see if we can get a few of these words right this time. So if we are going to truly understand how the modern industrial world was actually built, We have to look past the grand, sweeping, philosophical debates. We have to look past the academic theories of free trade and protectionism that we discussed in the last episode. Instead, we have to look down at the dirt. We have to talk about mud. We have to talk about distance. And we have to talk about the absolute crushing tyranny of physical geography. At the dawn of the 19th century, the United States was not a unified national economy. That is a retroactive fantasy. It was a fragile, disconnected collection of isolated island markets, separated by vast oceans of dense wilderness, unnavigable rivers, and impassable mountain ranges. Let me give you a sense of the friction of distance in the early 1800s. If you were a farmer or an early manufacturer in western Pennsylvania or Ohio in 1810, you were effectively trapped by geography. The cost to move a ton of wheat or iron over land to a coastal city was roughly the same as shipping that exact same ton of goods across the entire Atlantic Ocean to England. Let that sink in. The cost of physical movement was so astronomically high that it practically paralyzed domestic economic development. You cannot have a national industrial strategy, and you certainly cannot realize the massive economies of scale that Alexander Hamilton dreamed of if the physical cost of moving your product eats up 100% of your profit margin before it even leaves your home country. Before the 1820s, it took roughly 3 weeks for a letter to travel from New York City to Cincinnati. A heavy wagon of freight could take months, assuming the wooden wheels didn't shatter in the frozen ruts or sink to the axles in spring mud. The great thinkers of the era recognized this unglamorous but fundamental truth. All successful economic development, regardless of the overarching ideology, relied upon a new, powerful, enabling state. They needed a state that could provide massive, capital-intensive public goods that private markets simply could not or would not build on their own. The absolute necessity of this enabling state was baptized in fire during the War of 1812. When the United States went to war with the British Empire for the second time, the American military strategy was severely crippled, not just by British cannons, but by American geography. The military simply could not move troops, artillery, or rations from the eastern seaboard to the battlefronts in the Great Lakes region, or down to New Orleans. Wagons broke down. Pack animals starved. The roads were virtually non-existent. The lack of infrastructure was a massive national security vulnerability that almost cost the young republic its existence. So, in 1817, with the burning of Washington, D.C. still a fresh and painful memory, a young statesman from South Carolina named John C. Calhoun stood up in Congress. Calhoun introduced a piece of legislation known as the Bonus Bill. His goal was to take the $1.5 million bonus that the newly chartered Second Bank of the United States had paid to the federal government, along with all future federal dividends from that bank, and pour them into a permanent, massive, federally funded infrastructure fund. His plea to Congress was a masterclass in grand economic vision and national security. He declared, "We are great and rapidly, I was about to say fearfully growing. This is our pride and our danger, our weakness and our strength. Let us then bind the republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space." Now, President James Madison actually vetoed that specific bill on his last day in office, arguing on strict constitutional grounds that the federal government did not have the explicit power to build local roads. But Calhoun's vision had let the genie out of the bottle. If the federal government wouldn't do it, the state governments would. What followed over the course of the 19th century was a transportation revolution, a relentless collective advance in civil engineering that completely rewired the physical world and laid the literal groundwork for American economic dominance. First came the turnpikes. States began chartering private companies to build toll roads, laying down crushed stone and gravel to create all-weather surfaces. Then came the era of massive state-funded canal projects. The undisputed king of these was New York's Erie Canal, completed in 1825. This was a staggering public works project, derisively called Clinton's Ditch, after Governor DeWitt Clinton, who championed it. It was 363 miles long, dug largely by hand and horsepower through the wilderness of upstate New York, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The economic impact of the Erie Canal was equivalent to a modern-day superpower discovering teleportation. It dropped the cost of freight between Buffalo and New York City by an astonishing 95%. It cut travel time from weeks to days. Overnight, it made New York City the undisputed commercial and financial capital of the continent, a crown it has never surrendered. It triggered a canal-building mania across the country as states desperately tried to replicate New York's success. Then came Robert Fulton and the steamboats, transforming the massive river systems of the American interior. For the first time in human history, cargo could easily move up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers against the current. But canals froze in the winter, and rivers only went where nature dictated. The real revolution, the absolute apex of 19th century infrastructure, the technology that would finally conquer space, 2D space, and bind the Republic together just as Calhoun envisioned, was the railroad. Let's look at the sheer, staggering scale of the American railroad boom. In the 30 years prior to 1871, the United States managed to lay down 45,000 miles of track. For a young, largely agrarian nation, that was a miraculous achievement. It connected the eastern seaboard to the Midwest, moving grain east and manufactured goods west. But what happened next defies comprehension. In the 30 years after 1871, they added another 170,000 miles of track. They replaced brittle iron rails with Bessemer steel. They standardized track gauges so railcars could move seamlessly from one company's line to another. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States had more railroad mileage than the rest of the entire world combined. Now, if you read a sanitized high school history textbook, you might walk away thinking this was purely private sector triumph, a story of rugged, cigar-chomping capitalists like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Leland Stanford, and Jay Gould, taming the continent through sheer free market willpower and entrepreneurial grit. But that is a complete myth. This explosion of infrastructure, particularly the push against the western or across the western half of the continent, was not a spontaneous free market miracle. It was driven by one of the most consequential, heavily subsidized public-private partnerships in human history. In 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War, the federal government fundamentally changed the game. With the Southern politicians who traditionally opposed federal infrastructure spending having ceded from the Union, the Northern Industrial Bloc finally had the votes to execute a grand, unified national strategy. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The state recognized a hard economic reality. Building a transcontinental railroad across the Rocky Mountains and the desolate Great Plains was a project of such staggering capital risk that no private bank in its right mind would ever finance it alone. It was a black hole for capital. The return on investment was decades away, if it ever came at all. So, the government stepped in as the ultimate underwriter. They did this by leveraging the one massive asset they had in absolute abundance: public land. The federal government essentially gave away millions upon millions of acres of the public domain to 4 of the 5 great transcontinental railroad companies, most famously the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. But it wasn't just a blind giveaway. It was a highly calculated, pragmatic financing mechanism designed to incentivize impossible construction. Here's how the deal worked. For every single mile of track a company laid, the government gave them the 400-foot right-of-way for the track itself. But that wasn't the real prize. The real prize was the adjacent land. For every mile of track, the railroad was granted alternating square-mile sections of public land on either side of the route, extending up to 20 miles out. This created a massive checkerboard pattern of ownership stretching across the continent. Half the squares owned by the railroad, the other half retained by the federal government. Virtually overnight, the railroads became incredibly land-rich. They were granted land areas larger than entire European nations. They could use this immense portfolio of real estate as collateral to issue massive corporate bonds to Wall Street and European investors. That hard cash brought the vast quantities of steel, the black powder, the timber, and the tens of thousands of immigrant laborers, largely Irish in the East and Chinese in the West, needed to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And once the tracks were laid, that adjacent checkerboard land instantly skyrocketed in value. The federal government benefited because the value of its remaining half of the checkerboard doubled or tripled. But the railroads became empires. They turned around and sold their granted land to incoming settlers, farmers, ranchers, and mining companies. They set up aggressive marketing campaigns in Europe, promising cheap, fertile land in the American West to anyone willing to emigrate. They essentially built their own customer base from scratch. The proceeds from the sale of this free land financed the actual physical construction of the railroads and enriched the railroad barons beyond imagination. This policy cracked open the American West for massive agricultural extraction and settlement. It physically united the two coasts, but it also had a deeply complex economic outcome that fundamentally reshaped American society. It drastically, structurally increased wealth inequality. And that brings us to a crucial dynamic that every economic developer needs to intimately understand. When you build infrastructure, you don't just connect people in a vacuum. You fundamentally alter the competitive balance of power. You destroy old, localized economies to birth new, centralized ones. Before the railroad, a local blacksmith, a regional furniture maker, or a small-town flour mill had a captive market. Because transportation costs were so astronomically high, no outsider could reach them. They enjoyed a geographic monopoly, heavily protected by the friction of distance. But the moment the steam locomotive pulled into town, that protective wall of distance collapsed instantly. Suddenly, a massive, highly capitalized, incredibly efficient factory in Chicago or Pittsburgh could load its mass-produced goods onto a freight car and undercut the local artisan in his own hometown. The local blacksmith couldn't compete with the massive foundries of the East. The local cobbler couldn't compete with the mechanized shoe factories of New England. Let's look at exactly how this played out on the ground. Let's look at the ultimate 19th century corporate disruptor, Sears, Roebuck and Company. If you lived in a rural farming town in Nebraska in 1880, your entire consumer life was dictated by the owner of the local general store. Because it used to be so incredibly expensive and difficult to ship goods into town over dirt roads, that store owner essentially held a geographic monopoly. He decided exactly what products you had access to, and he decided the markup. If he wanted to charge you double the fair price for a steel plow, a coffee grinder, or a pair of leather boots, you paid it because you had absolutely no other option. But then the federal government subsidized the Transcontinental Railroad, and they laid a steel track right through your county. Suddenly, a guy sitting in Chicago named Richard Sears realized something profound. He didn't need to spend millions of dollars opening 1,000 brick-and-mortar stores to compete with those local merchants. He just needed to leverage the massive brand new physical infrastructure of the railroad and the communications infrastructure of the U.S. Postal Service. Sears printed a mail order catalog. By 1897, it was a staggering 500 pages long. It was the 19th century equivalent of Amazon.com. The railroad delivered that catalog directly into the hands of the Nebraska farmer. And when that farmer opened it, the economic illusion of the local general store shattered. Because Sears was buying goods from massive, hyper-efficient urban factories at an incredible volume, he could offer prices that absolutely destroyed the local merchant's markup. The farmer could fill out a paper order form, put it on an eastbound train, and a few weeks later, the westbound train would drop off exactly what he ordered. A pocket watch, a Singer sewing machine, a Winchester rifle, a piano. Eventually, you could literally order an entire prefabricated multi-story house out of the Sears catalog, and they would ship you the pre-cut timber, the nails, and the blueprints on a flatbed railcar. This was an absolute miracle for the rural consumer. Their standard of living skyrocketed overnight. But for the local general store owner, for the small town blacksmith, for the regional cobbler, it was an extinction level event. They simply couldn't match the scale, the variety, or the pricing of the Chicago warehouses. The protective wall of distance was gone. By drastically lowering trade costs, the railroad relentlessly reallocated market shares. It forced the less productive, undercapitalized local entrepreneurs to exit the market completely. The wealth and consumer spending of the rural periphery was aggressively sucked directly into the centralized industrial cores of Chicago and New York. Infrastructure binds a nation together, yes. It raises the aggregate wealth of the nation. But it is also a ruthless engine of market consolidation. It creates a system where the strong can finally reach and conquer the weak. This is the double-edged sword of the enabling state. The same state that gives you the tools to reach the world also gives the world the tools to reach you. So, the enabling state built the physical arteries. It conquered space, slashed the transportation costs, and unified a fragmented continent into the largest single domestic market on the planet. But physical infrastructure is completely useless without human infrastructure. You can build the largest steel mill on Earth, you can lay down miles of track, but if the workers walking through the factory gate cannot read the operating schematics, if they lack the discipline to show up for a 12-hour shift, or if they cannot perform the basic arithmetic needed to operate a blast furnace, your national system will collapse under its own weight. In our next segment, we are going to look at the second half of the 19th century's great public-private partnership. We're going to step away from the steel and the mud, and we are going to look at how the state engineered the human mind. Be right back. So, you've built the factory. You've raised the capital. You have Alexander Hamilton's protective tariff shielding you from British competition, and you have a brand new federally subsidized railroad track connecting your loading dock directly to the massive consumer markets of Chicago and New York. You have solved the physical equation of industrialization. But tomorrow morning, the factory whistle is going to blow at exactly 6 a.m. Who's going to be walking through the door? If it's the year 1820, the people walking through your door are agricultural laborers. They're farmers and the children of farmers. For 10,000 years of human history, these people have lived and worked by the rhythms of the sun, the seasons, and the weather. They work intensely during the harvest, and they repair tools by the fire during the winter. They do not own pocket watches. They have never been told to stand at a specific station and perform the exact same repetitive motions 400 times an hour for 12 hours straight. Furthermore, they likely can't read the operating schematics for the mechanized loom you just imported from France. They cannot perform the basic arithmetic required to measure the chemical inputs for a textile dye. And, most problematically for a 19th century factory owner, they possess a fiercely independent agrarian mindset that deeply resents being micromanaged by a foreman. The physical infrastructure of the railroad conquered space, but the state now faced an equally monumental task. It had to conquer the human mind. It had to engineer a workforce capable of actually operating the industrial future. Welcome to the second foundational pier of the 19th century enabling state, the radical, highly controversial invention of public education. Today, we take the public school system entirely for granted. You pay your property taxes, you put your kid on a yellow bus, and the state teaches them how to read. It feels as natural as breathing. But at the dawn of the 19th century, the idea that the state should be responsible for the education of the general public was considered revolutionary, borderline socialist, and deeply offensive to a vast portion of the population. Before the 1820s, education was a largely private, completely unregulated, and highly localized affair. If you were wealthy, you hired a private tutor for your sons. If you were a member of a strong religious community, your church might run a modest grammar school to ensure the children could read the Bible. But if you were poor, or if you lived on the rural frontier, your children simply worked. They learned the family trade, they cleared the fields, and they remained illiterate. The concept of a universal, tax-funded school system faced massive resistance. Imagine being a childless 50-year-old farmer in Ohio in 1825. Suddenly, the local government tells you that your property taxes are going up so that the neighbor's 6 children can learn to read. The immediate political response was outrage. Why should my hard-earned capital be seized by the state to educate someone else's child? To overcome this resistance, the advocates for public education didn't just appeal to morality or human rights. They appealed to cold, hard economic and social survival. They argued that a republic could not function if its voters were ignorant, and an industrial economy could not compete if its workers were feral. But the resistance to public schools wasn't just about taxes. It was about something far more visceral. It was a massive, violent political clash over identity. Once you establish that the state has the power to build a standardized industrial workforce, the immediate explosive question becomes, whose standard are we using? Who gets to program the operating system of the next generation? If you want to see how incredibly messy human infrastructure can be, you have to look at the Bible Wars of the early 1840s. At this time, American cities like New York and Boston were experiencing a massive wave of immigration, primarily Irish Catholics fleeing famine and poverty. They were the raw labor force pouring into the new factories. The wealthy, established Protestant business elite of New York, the men running the public school society, looked at this wave of Catholic immigrants and panicked. They viewed them as dangerous, unassimilated outsiders loyal to a foreign pope. So they decided to use the newly formed public school system to aggressively assimilate them. They did this by mandating the daily reading of the Protestant King James Bible in every classroom. The standard reading textbooks explicitly contained anti-Catholic slurs, referring to the Catholic Church as deceitful and un-American. The state was literally using tax dollars to engineer the religious and cultural identity out of the immigrant workforce. The Catholic community, led by a fierce, uncompromising leader named Bishop John Hughes, revolted. He argued that it was outright tyranny for Catholic laborers to pay public taxes to a state school system that actively indoctrinated their children against their own families. He demanded that either the state remove the Protestant bias from the curriculum or give the Catholic community a proportionate share of the tax money to run their own parallel schools. The public school establishment refused. The rhetoric escalated. This wasn't just a polite debate at a school board meeting. This conflict boiled over into literal street warfare. In 1844, in Philadelphia, the dispute over which version of the Bible should be read in public schools triggered the Philadelphia nativist riots. Armed mobs burned down 2 Catholic churches, destroyed hundreds of dwellings, and brought the state militia into the streets with artillery to restore order. Dozens of people were killed. Let that sink in. People were dying in the streets of American cities over the exact curriculum the state was using to train the future workforce. This is the hidden friction of human capital development. When you lay a railroad track, the steel doesn't have an opinion. It just sits there. But when the enabling state attempts to standardize the human mind for an industrial economy, it inherently collides with culture, religion, and family sovereignty. To actually build this system, the architects of the 19th century had to navigate this explosive terrain. They realized they had to carefully decouple the economic utility of reading and writing from the heavy-handed religious indoctrination of the era, leading to the gradual secularization of American public schools. But as I said earlier, we cannot view this history through rose-colored glasses. The early models of public education were not driven by a utopian desire for individual self-fulfillment. They were highly calculated exercises in social engineering. Let's look at one of the earliest blueprints for American public education, drafted by none other than Thomas Jefferson. In 1779, during the American Revolution, Jefferson authored a document called the Bill for the More General Diffusion of Knowledge for the State of Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia. Jefferson understood that a new nation needed an intellectual infrastructure just as badly as it needed roads. But Jefferson's vision was strictly, unabashedly elitist. He proposed a highly stratified, two-track educational system specifically designed to separate the laboring and the learned. Under his plan, all free children, which notably excluded the massive enslaved population, would receive 3 years of basic, state-funded instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Just enough to read a newspaper and keep out of debt. After those 3 years, the system became a ruthless sorting mechanism. The vast majority of children would be sent back to the fields and the workshops, the laboring class. But the state would identify the brightest boys from the poorest families and offer them scholarships to continue their education at state expense. Jefferson's stated goal for the system was exceptionally blunt. He wrote that the purpose of public education was to rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Let me repeat that. To rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. The goal wasn't to elevate the entire population into enlightened scholars. The goal was to extract the most naturally gifted intellectual capital from the lower classes and pipeline them into the universities to serve as the nation's new aristocratic leadership. The rubbish, the vast majority of the population, was simply given the bare minimum required to be functional, obedient citizens. Other states tried different approaches, but they often failed because they misunderstood human psychology. In 1790, Pennsylvania codified a new state constitution that called for the establishment of schools where the poor may be taught gratis, meaning for free. The state essentially set up a massive means testing system. The wealthy and the middle class were expected to pay tuition to private academies out of their own pockets. But if you were destitute, you could declare yourself a pauper to the local government, and the state would cover the cost of your child's education as at a designated charity school. As you might imagine, it was a complete disaster. The state vastly underestimated the pride of the working class. Parents outright refused to declare themselves paupers and subject their families to the humiliating social stigma of sending their kids to a charity school. They would rather their children remain completely illiterate than publicly admit absolute financial defeat. The Pennsylvania model proved a crucial lesson in public policy that still applies to economic development today. If you design a public good exclusively for the poor, it will inherently carry a stigma that undermines its entire purpose. To build a truly functional national workforce, the state needs a system that was universal. It needed a system where the son of the banker and the son of the blacksmith sat in the exact same room, under the exact same rules. And that brings us to the most incredible industrial-scale educational experiment of the 19th century, the Lancasterian system. By the turn of the century, New York City was exploding in population. Industrialization was accelerating, immigration was rising, and the streets were flooded with unsupervised, uneducated children. The city's business elite were terrified of social unrest, crime, and a completely undisciplined future workforce. They needed to educate tens of thousands of children, and they needed to do it as cheaply and efficiently as humanly possible. I'm having a hard time with words today, folks. Apologies. In 1805, a group of wealthy philanthropists and business leaders, led by Mayor DeWitt Clinton, the same man who championed the Erie Canal, formed the Public School Society of New York. To solve their crisis, they imported a highly experimental educational model from England, invented by a Quaker named Joseph Lancaster. The Lancasterian model did not look like a modern classroom. It looked exactly like a textile mill. It was the physical application of industrial mass production applied to human children. And here's how it worked. Instead of a small classroom with 20 students and one teacher, a Lancasterian school was housed in a massive, cavernous warehouse. A single adult master teacher would stand on a raised platform at the front of the room, overseeing upwards of 500 to 1,000 students at the exact same time. Now, obviously one adult cannot teach 1,000 children. So the master used a strictly hierarchical management structure. The master taught the oldest, most advanced students. These older students, called monitors, were then deployed down the ranks. A monitor was put in charge of a row of 10 younger students. The monitor drilled them, tested them, and punished them. It was entirely standardized. The children didn't have paper. It was too expensive. They had desks filled with a thin layer of sand. A monitor would hold up a card with the letter A. On a synchronized command, 10 children would trace the letter A in the sand with their fingers. Fingers! Come on, Devin. The monitor inspected it, wiped the sand flat, and they moved to the letter B. The entire system was driven by military-style regimentation, governed by a complex system of whistles, hand signals, and bells. A bell rang to sit. A bell rang to stand. A bell rang to march in a straight line to the recitation station. Why did the business elite of New York absolutely love this system? First, the unit economics were spectacular. Because you only had to pay one adult salary for every 1,000 students, the cost per student dropped to roughly $1.25 a year. It was the cheapest educational model ever devised. But secondly, and far more importantly, the Lancasterian system explicitly emphasized strict discipline, total obedience to authority, and absolute punctuality. If you are a factory owner in 1820, this is the holy grail of social engineering. You don't want a workforce of free-thinking philosophers who question authority. You want a workforce that has been deeply psychologically conditioned from the age of 6 to hear a bell ring, stop what they are doing, move in a straight line, and follow the exact instructions of a middle management foreman without a single word of complaint. The Lancasterian schools were essentially compliance factories, churning out the exact human capital required to operate the new industrial machinery. Now, the factory model of education solved the immediate problem of basic literacy and social control in the United States. And by the 1830s and 40s, champions like Horace Mann pushed the free school movement further, establishing the modern consensus. Schools should be tax supported, attendance should be legally required, and teachers should have at least some basic training. But if you want to see the absolute gold standard of 19th century human capital development, the system that truly terrified the rest of the world, you have to look back across the Atlantic. You have to look at Prussia. When we talked about Frederick List and the Zollverein in the last episode, we noted how methodically the German states engineered their economic rise. Their approach to education was no different. Prussia was decades, if not a full century, ahead of the rest of the world. Way back in 1763, Frederick the Great had already issued a decree requiring compulsory school attendance for all children from ages 5 to 13. But it was in the aftermath of their devastating military defeat by Napoleon in 1806 that the Prussians truly weaponized their educational system. Under the sweeping reforms of Wilhelm von Humboldt, the Prussian state decided that leaving education to local amateurs, church volunteers, and monitorial factories was a massive vulnerability. They believed that the strength of the nation was directly tied to the intellectual rigor of its citizens. So, Prussia did something revolutionary. They transformed teaching from a low-status, part-time gig into a highly respected, heavily regulated profession. The Prussian state established normal schools, dedicated state-run universities specifically designed to train teachers. They instituted a rigorous state examination. If you wanted to teach in a Prussian school, you had to pass a government board. Once you passed, you weren't just a local employee. You were officially a civil servant of the Prussian state. You received a guaranteed salary, a state pension, and immense social respect. The government referred to the teaching profession as one of high dignity and efficiency, if only. The Prussians didn't just teach obedience. They taught deep, technical proficiency. They built a streamlined pipeline that identified talent in the primary schools, routed it through rigorous technical high schools called Realschulen, and fed it directly into the most advanced research universities on the planet. This unglamorous, highly bureaucratic investment in the professionalization of the mind paid off in ways that completely altered world history. By the late 19th century, while the United States was still trying to standardize its chaotic localized school districts, Germany had built an absolute juggernaut of human capital. That Prussian educational pipeline is the exact reason why German chemical companies, precision engineering firms, and optical manufacturers completely dominated the global market leading up to World War I. They possessed a workforce that was simply smarter, better trained, and more technically capable than anyone else's. So let's step back and look at the whole board. Whether you are a strict disciple of Adam Smith, praying to the invisible hand, or a hardcore believer in Frederick List's protectionist national system, none of those economic theories matter if you cannot physically execute the work. A firm cannot exploit economies of scale if it cannot physically transport its goods to the market. And it cannot maintain a competitive advantage if its workforce cannot read a manual, calculate a formula, or show up on time. These massive foundational investments, railroads financed by unprecedented federal land grants, and public schools engineered to create a compliant, highly literate industrial workforce are the common denominator of the 19th century. They are the preconditions for any model of economic development. And if you are an economic developer listening to this today, this is your entire world. You are still executing this exact dual mandate. When you spend your mornings fighting the federal government for infrastructure grants to expand your regional airport, or lobbying the state to widen the highway interchange leading to your new industrial park, you are carrying on the legacy of the Pacific Railway Act. And when you spend your afternoon sitting in endless, exhausting committee meetings with your local community college and the HR directors of your biggest manufacturing plants, trying to design a custom, state-funded mechatronics curriculum to train the next generation of workers, you are continuing the work of the public school movement. You are the modern architects of the enabling state. You are building the physical arteries and the human capital that make prosperity possible. In our next segment, we are going to look at what happens when these newly industrialized, hyper-connected, highly educated national systems finally turn outward, look across the oceans, and collide with one another on the global stage. Stick around. We'll be right back. Now, I thought this episode and the topics within it were important enough that we're going to go a little bit longer than usual, which means that we're going to forego the nerd section. Instead, like I said before, we're going to take a step back and look at a more macro level as to what was going on back in the 19th century. So welcome back. It is incredibly easy to get caught up in the glamorous, high-stakes trade wars of history. We love to debate the grand, sweeping philosophies. We love to argue over the precise tariff rates of Alexander Hamilton or the aggressive protectionist fortress built by Frederick List and the German Zollverein. But as we have seen today, whether you are a strict disciple of Adam Smith's laissez-faire free market or a hardcore believer in state-directed industrial policy, the grand theory is completely irrelevant without the physical and intellectual scaffolding. You can pass all the protective tariffs you want, but a local firm cannot actually exploit the massive economies of scale hiding behind Hamilton's tariff wall if it literally cannot ship its finished goods across the country without going bankrupt on freight costs. You can steal all the blueprints for the most advanced British steam engines in the world, but that stolen IP is useless if the workers standing on your assembly line can't read the operating manual or lack the deeply conditioned discipline to execute a standardized process. The physical arteries of the transportation revolution and the highly engineered human capital of the public school movement were not just parallel historical events. They were deeply, fundamentally symbiotic. They fed on each other, creating a massive compounding loop of economic acceleration. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of running a transcontinental railroad in the 1870s. Before the railroad, a corporation was usually just a wealthy merchant, his two sons, and a guy who kept the ledger books in a single room. But a railroad was a completely different beast. You had thousands of employees operating massive, lethal pieces of heavy machinery, moving in opposite directions on a single track spread across thousands of miles in multiple time zones. If you lacked precise coordination, trains literally crashed into each other at full speed. To manage this, the railroads had to invent something the world had never seen before: corporate middle management. They needed station masters, telegraph operators, logistics coordinators, accountants, and regional supervisors. And where did this massive new army of white-collar and specialized blue-collar workers come from? They came directly from the newly established public school pipelines. The railroad desperately needed workers who could instantly read a telegraph cipher, calculate fuel burn rates, and execute complex written logistical orders without needing a foreman standing over their shoulder. The enabling state built the tracks, but it also built the mines required to run the trains. If you want to see the absolute pinnacle of this synthesis in the 19th century, the most spectacular example of a nation realizing that infrastructure and education are the twin prerequisites to survival, we have to again look at Japan. In our previous episode, we talked about the Meiji Restoration of 1868. We talked about how the Japanese samurai class violently dismantled their own feudal system to aggressively industrialize and catch up to the Western imperial powers. But the Japanese leaders didn't just build state-owned silk mills and shipyards. They understood that the factories were just the tip of the spear. The real power of the West lay in its enabling state. In 1871, the Meiji government launched the Iwakura Mission. They sent their top government officials, scholars, and engineers on a massive multi-year espionage and study tour across the United States and Europe. Their mission was simple: find the best structural foundations in the world, bring the blueprints back to Tokyo, and build them faster. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of the ambassadors in 1871. These were men who, just a few years prior, were wearing traditional swords and governing a rigidly feudal agrarian society. When they landed in San Francisco and boarded an American transcontinental train for the first time, the psychological shock was absolute. Imagine being a samurai, accustomed to traveling by horse, suddenly hurtling across the Rocky Mountains at 40 miles an hour in a massive steel, steam-powered machine. They weren't just impressed, they were deeply, existentially terrified. They realized instantly that the true military and economic power of the West was not just in their cannons, but in their staggering logistical capacity. They treated this trip as a massive corporate espionage operation. They documented everything. They literally measured the gauge of the railroad tracks. They sketched the telegraph poles that allowed instant communication across thousands of miles. When they traveled to Europe, they didn't waste time touring royal palaces. They went deep into the grime of the factories, the coal mines, and the shipyards. And most importantly, they went to the schools. When they reached Germany, they were utterly mesmerized by the Prussian education system. They didn't see isolated ivory towers for philosophers. They saw highly synchronized, state-directed engines of power. They watched the German state relentlessly churning out the engineers, chemists, and middle management bureaucrats needed to run a modern industrial empire. The Iwakura mission realized a horrifying truth. If Japan did not immediately build these twin foundations, the physical infrastructure to move goods and the intellectual infrastructure to invent them, they would be conquered and colonized by the West. They looked at the British Navy and copied it. They looked at the American banking system and copied it. But above all, they knew they had to copy the American railroad and the Prussian schoolhouse. The Meiji government immediately began laying thousands of miles of telegraph wire and railroad track, fundamentally connecting the mountainous, fragmented islands of Japan into a unified national market. Simultaneously, they launched an absolute revolution in human capital. In 1872, just 4 years after the Restoration, the government issued the Fundamental Code of Education, establishing the first system of nationwide compulsory public schooling in Japanese history. By 1890, they issued the Imperial Rescript on Education, which deeply intertwined technical literacy with fierce national loyalty. And the results were staggering. In a single generation, Japan went from a feudal agrarian society with highly localized education to boasting one of the highest universal literacy rates on the entire planet. The Japanese government could not have successfully pivoted its state-run factories over to the private zaibatsu conglomerates if it hadn't simultaneously built an education system capable of feeding those factories with highly trained, disciplined, and literate workers. They proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the universal thesis of the 19th century. The enabling functions of the state are the absolute preconditions for any successful development model. And you know what? I said before that we weren't going to do the nerd section, but screw it. We're going to. So, in the nerd section, we are going to take these massive historical forces and apply them directly to modern spreadsheets on your desk. If you're going to be leaving us, thank you, as always, for tuning in to the Architects of Prosperity here on Site Selectors or People 2. For those of you that are continuing on, my fellow nerds, stick around. We'll be right back. All right, let's get into the deep mechanics. For a long time, classical economists treated technological progress and human knowledge as external factors. They were treated like weather, things that just sort of happened to an economy from the outside. But in the 1980s and 90s, an economist named Paul Romer revolutionized the field with something called endogenous growth theory, work that eventually won him the Nobel Prize. Endogenous growth theory mathematically proves what the 19th century state builders already knew in their bones. Economic growth is not an external accident. It is generated from within the system. And the two primary engines of that internal growth are human capital, education, and the physical capacity to share ideas and goods, infrastructure. Romer pointed out that unlike a lump of coal or a barrel of oil, knowledge is non-rivalrous. If I use a recipe to bake a cake, it doesn't stop you from using that exact same recipe to bake a cake. But to actually share that recipe and to improve upon it, you need a highly educated population capable of understanding it, and a highly advanced infrastructure network capable of transmitting it. When you combine a dense concentration of highly educated people with world-class infrastructure, you create what economists call knowledge spillovers. Engineers at competing firms go to the exact same coffee shops, talk to the same university professors, and seamlessly exchange ideas, accelerating the rate of innovation for the entire region. This is the exact mathematical formula that created Silicon Valley. Now, how does this apply to you, the modern economic developer? It applies because this exact synthesis is the fundamental framework of modern site selection. When a massive corporation, Let's say an advanced semiconductor manufacturer or a major electric vehicle automotive company hires a site selection firm like Hyphen Strategies to find a location for a $5 billion gigafactory. They use a highly rigid, unglamorous matrix. They are not looking at your marketing brochures as much as you might think. They're not looking at your new downtown Riverwalk. They are rigorously evaluating the modern iteration of the enabling state. Column A of the matrix is physical infrastructure. Can your local power grid deliver 200 megawatts of uninterrupted, redundant electricity? Can your municipal water system handle the millions of gallons required for industrial cooling? Do you have heavy haul rail spurs connecting directly to deep water ports and a highway interchange capable of handling 500 semi-trucks a day without causing a regional traffic collapse? Column B of the matrix is human capital. They will pull the data on your regional labor shed. They want to know the exact graduation rates of your local high schools. They will scrutinize the specific output of your community college's mechatronics and advanced manufacturing programs. They want to know the exact underemployment rate. How many retail workers in your county have the baseline arithmetic and reading comprehension skills to be upskilled into precision machine operators? If you have a world-class multimodal logistics hub, but your local workforce lacks basic technical literacy and suffers from massive absenteeism, the site selector will cross you off the list. The capital will not flow. Conversely, if you have a brilliant cluster of universities churning out top-tier engineering talent, but your region is bottlenecked by crumbling bridges, overlooked power grids, and terrible broadband access, the site selector will cross you off the list. The capital will not flow. You must have both. These highly pragmatic structural foundations, massive public infrastructure projects, and an educational system deeply engineered to create a capable, adaptable workforce are the common denominator of all economic development. They were the secret in 1850, and they are the secret today. If you are an economic developer, a city planner, or a regional policymaker listening to this is your bread and butter. You are still executing this exact dual mandate. When you spend 2 years fighting for federal matching grants to dredge your port and expand your regional logistics capacity, you are doing the work of the Pacific Railway Act. When you sit in endless, exhausting committee meetings with your local community college chancellor and the HR directors of your biggest manufacturing plants trying to design a custom, highly specific industrial robotics curriculum, you're doing the work of the public school movement. You are the ones laying the tracks and training the minds. Like we said before, you are the modern architects of the enabling state. I'm Devin Hillsdon-Smith. Thank you for sticking with me through this deep dive into the dirt, the steel, and the chalkboards of the 19th century. Thank you for listening to the Architects of Prosperity here on Site Selectors Are People Too. Join us next time for episode 8, where we will look at the explosive consequences of this era. We're going to see what happens when these newly industrialized, hyper-connected, and heavily armed national systems finally run out of domestic territory and violently collide on the global stage. And remember, whether you are building a transcontinental railroad or pitching a new advanced manufacturing park, site selectors are people too. See ya. Just a heads up, views expressed in this podcast are solely my own and are not attributable to any employers, whether past or present. Thank you.